Most people think Seiko is all about value, affordable, reliable, nothing more. But that's not the full picture. Because once you start looking at the right models, something changes. The finishing feels better, the designs feel more refined, and the overall presence starts to feel expensive. And that's where it gets interesting. Because under $1,000, Seiko is making watches that don't just offer value, they actually feel like they belong in a higher category. Watches that surprise you on the wrist. Watches that look better than expected. And watches that quietly compete with brands that cost much more. So today, we're looking at 5 Seiko watches that prove Seiko is more than just value. Let's start with one that changes your perception instantly. Number 1, and this is where Seiko stops looking like a value brand. This is the Seiko Presage Sharp-Edged series. At first glance, the dial immediately stands out. Not because it's flashy, but because of the texture. There's depth to it, a pattern inspired by traditional Japanese design that catches light in a way that feels far more refined than you'd expect. And that's where it starts to feel different. Because this doesn't look like a typical Seiko. It looks sharp, structured, almost architectural. The case follows that same idea. Clean edges, defined lines, and a mix of brushed and polished surfaces that reflect light with precision. Nothing feels soft or rounded. Everything feels intentional. And that's what gives it that premium presence. On the wrist, it feels balanced and controlled. Not too thin, not bulky, just well proportioned. It wears like something in a completely different category. Inside, you get Seiko's automatic movement with a strong power reserve. But honestly, this watch isn't about specs, it's about perception. Because the moment you see it in person, you start thinking about value. You start thinking about design, about finishing, about how something at this price can look this refined. And once you notice those details, it's hard to see Seiko the same way again. It sets the tone for everything else on this list. And that's where everything changes. Because this isn't what people expect from Seiko. And that's exactly why it takes the first spot on this list. Number 2, and this is where Seiko starts to feel seriously expensive. This is the Seiko Prospex Speedtimer Panda. At first glance, it grabs your attention instantly. The contrast between the white dial and the black subdials gives it that classic Panda look, something usually associated with much higher-end chronographs. And that's what makes it hit differently. Because this doesn't feel like a typical Seiko. It feels more refined, more focused, almost like something designed to compete above its price. The dial has real depth. The subdials are well placed, the markers are sharp, and everything feels balanced. Everything feels controlled. And that's where the watch stands out. The case adds to that impression. Brushed and polished surfaces work together to catch light, giving the watch a presence that feels far more premium than expected. On the wrist, it feels solid and confident. Not too large, not too small, just perfectly proportioned. Inside, you get a solar chronograph movement, which means you're getting the look of a mechanical chronograph, but with the simplicity and reliability of quartz. And that combination works surprisingly well, because instead of worrying about maintenance, you just enjoy the watch. And this is where the perception shifts again, because this doesn't feel like a value chronograph. It feels like a complete, well-executed piece that could easily sit in a higher price category. Clean, balanced, surprisingly premium, and that's exactly why it takes the second spot on this list. Number 3, and this is where Seiko shows real character. This is the Seiko Prospex Baby Alpinist. At first glance, it doesn't look like a typical sports watch. The dial has a deep, rich green tone that immediately stands out, but in a subtle, controlled way. And that's what makes it interesting. Because instead of trying to be bold, this watch builds its identity through detail. The sunburst finish changes under light, shifting from darker shades to brighter reflections depending on the angle. It's not flashy, but it's never boring. And that's a hard balance to get right. The case keeps things compact and wearable. Clean lines, smooth finishing, and proportions that feel just right on the wrist. It's sporty, but with a refined edge. And that mix gives it versatility. You can wear it casually, but it doesn't feel out of place in more dressed settings. On the wrist, it feels balanced and comfortable. Not heavy, not oversized, just easy to live with. Inside, you get Seiko's automatic movement with a strong power reserve. Reliable, simple, and built for everyday use. But again, this watch isn't about specs. It's about how it feels. Because this doesn't feel like a basic field watch. It feels more considered, more designed, more complete than expected. And this is where the perception shifts. Again, because instead of feeling like just another Seiko, it starts to feel like something with its own identity. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 4, and this is where Seiko starts to play with design. This is the Seiko SSA425. At first glance, the dial immediately feels different. Not just clean, but layered. The open heart design draws your eyes straight to the movement, giving the watch a sense of depth that you don't usually expect at this level. And that's what makes it stand out, because instead of hiding the mechanics, this watch puts them on display. But it doesn't feel overdone. The layout stays balanced, the markers are clean, the hands are sharp, and everything feels aligned in a way that keeps the dial controlled. Nothing feels messy. Everything feels intentional, and that balance is what makes the design work. The case keeps things classic. Smooth curves, polished surfaces, and proportions that sit comfortably on the wrist. It leans more toward dress than sport, but still feels modern. On the wrist, it feels light and refined. Easy to wear, easy to style, and visually more interesting than a typical dress watch. Inside, you get Seiko's automatic movement, simple, reliable, and visible through the dial itself. And that adds something different to the experience, because you're not just wearing the watch, you're watching it work. And this is where the perception shifts again. Because this doesn't feel like a basic design. It feels expressive, more detailed, more engaging than expected. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 5, and this is where Seiko turns simplicity into something unforgettable. This is the Seiko Presage Cocktail Time. At first glance, the dial is what grabs you instantly. Not because it's loud, but because of how it plays with light. The texture reflects differently from every angle, creating a depth that feels far more premium than you'd expect. And that's what makes it special. Because instead of relying on complexity, it relies on execution. The dial is clean, but never flat. The markers are sharp, the hands are refined, and everything feels balanced in a way that highlights the texture. Nothing feels forced. Everything feels intentional. And that's what gives it that elegant presence. The case stays classic and polished. Slim, simple, and easy to wear. Perfect for both formal settings and everyday use. On the wrist, it feels light and refined. Not flashy, not aggressive. Just smooth and composed. Inside, you get Seiko's automatic movement. Reliable, simple, and consistent. But honestly, that's not what makes this watch stand out. It's how it looks. Because this doesn't feel like an entry-level dress watch. It feels like something far more considered. Something designed to impress, without trying too hard. And this is where everything comes together. Because after seeing all 5, you start to realize something. Seiko isn't just about value. It's about design, it's about detail, it's about watches that feel far better than people expect. And once you see that, it's hard to look at the brand the same way again.